In 1997, Apple Computer was 90 days away from bankruptcy. The company that had invented the personal computer revolution, the company that once sold the Macintosh to millions of people who believed computing should be beautiful and intuitive, was dying. Market share had collapsed to 3%. The stock price had fallen from $60 to under $4. Every major analyst on Wall Street was telling investors to sell. Michael Dell, the CEO of Dell Computer, was asked what he would do if he were running Apple. He said he would shut it down and give the money back to the shareholders. 12 months later, Apple was profitable again. 25 years later, Apple became the first company in history worth $3 trillion. This is the story of how one of the greatest corporate collapses of the 1990s became one of the greatest corporate turnarounds in history. The story of Apple's near-death begins not in the 1990s but in 1985, the year Steve Jobs was forced out of the company he had co-founded 9 years earlier. Jobs had built Apple into the most exciting technology company in America. The Apple II made personal computing accessible to non-engineers. The Macintosh, released in 1984, had pioneered the graphical user interface and the mouse, but Jobs was also difficult, abrasive, and convinced that his vision was always correct even when the data suggested otherwise. His relationship with Apple's CEO John Sculley, whom Jobs himself had recruited from Pepsi, deteriorated completely. The board sided with Sculley. Jobs was stripped of all operational responsibilities, isolated within his own company, and eventually left in September 1985. He was 30 years old. He felt humiliated and betrayed. He had no way of knowing that Apple's worst years were still ahead. Without Jobs, Apple continued to sell Macintosh computers and make money. The company was profitable through the late 1980s, but it had lost a thing that made it dangerous, which was an obsessive commitment to making products that were genuinely better than anything else on the market. John Sculley ran Apple like a normal technology company. He focused on expanding product lines, increasing revenue, and managing relationships with corporate customers. He was good at these things, but he was not building products that made people feel anything. Meanwhile, Microsoft had licensed its Windows operating system to every major computer manufacturer in the world. Windows looked similar to the Macintosh interface but ran on cheaper hardware made by dozens of competing manufacturers. By the early 1990s, Windows had become the standard. Apple's market share began a slow, steady collapse that would not stop for over a decade. If you are fascinated by how great companies nearly destroy themselves and then fight their way back from the edge, subscribe to SnapOldBusiness. We cover the real stories behind the brands that shaped your world, the failures, the collapses, and the turnarounds nobody saw coming. Subscribe now and let us get back to Apple in 1993, the year everything started falling apart faster. By 1993, Apple was in serious trouble. John Sculley was forced out by the board and replaced by Michael Spindler, a German executive who had been running Apple's European operations. Spindler inherited a company with no clear strategy, too many products that overlapped with each other, and an operating system that was beginning to look outdated compared to Windows. He tried to turn the company around by cutting costs, laying off employees, and attempting to license the Mac operating system to other manufacturers, a strategy Apple had refused for years. The licensing experiment was a disaster. It created competitors who made cheaper Mac clones that undercut Apple's own sales without expanding the overall market. By 1996, Apple's financial position was so precarious that Spindler tried to sell the company. He approached IBM, Sun Microsystems, and Philips. All of them said no. In February 1996, Spindler was replaced by Gil Amelio, a former semiconductor executive who had successfully turned around National Semiconductor and had a reputation as a corporate fixer. Amelio walked into Apple and found a company that was worse off than anyone outside the company realized. The product line was a mess. Apple was selling dozens of different Macintosh models that confused customers and competed with each other. The operating system, macOS, was built on code written in the 1980s and was fundamentally broken. Apple had been trying to develop a new modern operating system for years in a project called Copeland, but Copeland had failed. The company had spent hundreds of millions of dollars and had nothing to show for it. Apple was burning through cash, losing money on every quarter, and running out of time. Gil Amelio made one decision that saved Apple, though he would not be the one to benefit from it. He decided that Apple needed to acquire a new operating system from outside the company rather than trying to build one internally. There were two options. One was a company called B Inc., run by a former Apple executive named Jean-Louis Gassi. The other was a company called Next Computer, run by Steve Jobs. Next had been founded by Jobs after he left Apple in 1985. It made high-end workstations and had developed an advanced object-oriented operating system called Next Step. The computers were beautiful, technically impressive, and commercial failures. Next had pivoted to selling software and had been quietly surviving for years with a small but loyal customer base. Apple's engineers preferred Next's technology. Amelio opened negotiations with both companies. Gassi demanded hundreds of millions of dollars. Jobs agreed to sell Next to Apple for $400 million. The deal closed in December 1996. Steve Jobs was back at Apple. Jobs returned as an advisor with no formal operational role. But from the moment he walked back into Apple's headquarters in Cupertino, it was clear that he would not stay on the sidelines. He attended product review meetings. He asked pointed, uncomfortable questions about why Apple was building so many mediocre products. He pushed for simplification, focus, and a return to the design philosophy that had made the original Macintosh important. Amelio, who was still CEO, found Jobs difficult and disruptive. The board found Jobs fascinating. In July 1997, after Apple posted an $816 million loss for the quarter, the board asked for Gil Amelio's resignation. Amelio left the board, named Steve Jobs interim CEO. Jobs had effectively taken back control of the company he had been forced out of 12 years earlier. Apple had 90 days of cash left. Jobs had one last chance to save it. Jobs moved immediately. His first decision was brutal but necessary. He cut Apple's product line from dozens of overlapping models to 4, 2 laptops and 2 desktops, 1 consumer model and 1 professional model in each category. Everything else was cancelled. Entire product teams were disbanded. Thousands of employees were laid off. The Mac loans, the licensing agreements that had been bleeding revenue, were terminated. Jobs then did something nobody expected, called Bill Gates. Microsoft and Apple had been bitter rivals for 15 years. Gates had little reason to help, but Jobs made a case. If Apple collapsed, Microsoft would face antitrust scrutiny as a monopoly. A healthy but smaller Apple was good for Microsoft. Gates agreed to invest $150 million in Apple and commit to developing Microsoft Office for the Mac for at least 5 years. When Jobs announced the deal at Macworld Boston in August 1997, the audience booed. They saw it as surrender. Jobs saw it as survival. The next product Apple released under Jobs was not the revolutionary new operating system or the groundbreaking hardware everyone expected. It was the iMac, released in May 1998. The iMac was a translucent, colorful, all-in-one desktop computer that looked like nothing else on the market. It had no floppy drive, which analysts called a fatal mistake. It was designed for people who wanted to get on the internet easily, which in 1998 was becoming the most important thing a computer could do. The iMac was not the fastest computer or the cheapest, but it was the first computer in years that people wanted to own because of how it looked and felt, not despite it. The iMac sold 800,000 units in its first 5 months. It became the best-selling computer in America. Apple was profitable again. The company was not saved yet, but it was no longer dying. Over the next 3 years, Jobs rebuilt Apple methodically. He became permanent CEO in January 2000, dropping the interim from his title. He moved the company's focus from desktop computers to portable devices, correctly predicting that computing was going to move away from desks and into pockets. In 2001, Apple released the iPod, a portable music player that could hold 1,000 songs. The iPod was not the first MP3 player, but it was the first one that worked seamlessly with a simple, elegant software ecosystem, iTunes. The iPod became a cultural phenomenon. It also did something more important. It taught Apple how to build consumer electronics products outside the computer category. And it taught a generation of consumers to trust Apple with their music, their money, and their identity. The iPod was the bridge between the Mac and the iPhone. In January 2007, Steve Jobs walked onto a stage in San Francisco and introduced the iPhone. He described it as 3 products in one: an iPod, a phone, and an internet communicator. Then he said, "Actually, it is just one device, and we are calling it iPhone." The iPhone had no physical keyboard, no stylus, and a touchscreen interface that responded to gestures nobody had seen before. Industry analysts were skeptical. Microsoft CEO Steve Ballmer laughed at it in an interview, saying there was no chance the iPhone would gain significant market share. Ballmer was wrong. The iPhone became the most successful consumer product in history. It redefined what a phone could be, created the smartphone industry as we know it today, and turned Apple into the most valuable company on the planet. The iPhone alone generates more revenue annually than the entirety of companies like Nike, Coca-Cola, or McDonald's. The financial transformation of Apple after Jobs returned is almost impossible to overstate. In 1997, Apple's annual revenue was $7 billion and the company was losing money. By 2011, the year Jobs died, Apple's revenue was $108 billion and the company was generating $25 billion in profit. By 2018, Apple became the first publicly traded company in history to reach a $1 trillion market value. By 2023, Apple passed $3 trillion. The company generates more profit per quarter than most Fortune 500 companies generate in revenue per year. The turnaround from 90 days of cash in 1997 to the most valuable company in history is the single greatest corporate comeback in modern business. What made the turnaround possible was not any single decision but a complete reversal of how Apple thought about itself. The Apple that nearly died in 1997 was trying to be a normal computer company. It was trying to compete on price, on product variety, on market share. It was building products for corporate IT departments, for people who cared about technical specifications, for a market that valued cheapness over quality. Jobs killed all of that. He rebuilt Apple around a simple idea: make a small number of products that are genuinely better than anything else. charge a premium for them, and refuse to compromise on design or user experience even when it is expensive or difficult. This was the opposite of what every business school and every industry consultant was telling technology companies to do in the 1990s. It worked because Jobs was willing to accept being a smaller company in order to be a better one. The other thing that saved Apple was the decision to control both hardware and software. Every other computer company in the 1990s licensed its operating system from Microsoft and competed on hardware. This meant dozens of companies making nearly identical computers and competing on price, which drove profit margins to almost nothing. Apple owned its own operating system. This allowed it to optimize hardware and software together in ways no other company could match. The iPhone worked the way it did because Apple designed the hardware, wrote the software, and controlled the entire experience. That integration became Apple's most defensible competitive advantage. It is why Apple can charge premium prices and maintain profit margins that other consumer electronics companies can only dream about. Steve Jobs died on October 5, 2011, at the age of 56 from complications related to pancreatic cancer. He had been diagnosed in 2003 and had fought the disease for 8 years while continuing to run Apple. His death created a genuine question about whether Apple could survive without him. The answer turned out to be yes, though not without significant challenges. Tim Cook, who had been Jobs' chief operating officer and was named CEO after Jobs' death, ran the company with a very different style. Cook was methodical, operational, and focused on efficiency rather than product vision. Under Cook, Apple became even more profitable but arguably less innovative. The products Apple has released since Jobs' death, the Apple Watch, AirPods, the Vision Pro headset, have all been successful, but none have redefined entire industries the way the iPhone did. Whether Apple can produce another category-defining product without Jobs remains the most important unanswered question about the company's future. The lessons from Apple's near collapse and recovery are relevant to any business at any scale. First, focus is more valuable than variety. Apple almost died trying to make dozens of mediocre products. It recovered by making for great ones. Simplification is painful because it means killing projects, firing people, and admitting previous decisions were wrong. But it is almost always the path back to viability for a struggling company. Second, premium pricing is a viable strategy if the product is genuinely better. Apple charges more than any competitor for phones, laptops, and tablets. Its profit margins are double or triple what competitors achieve. This only works because Apple products are consistently better in the ways customers actually care about: design, user experience, integration, long-term support. Quality allows premium pricing. Third, vertical integration creates defensible competitive advantage. Owning the entire stack, hardware, software, services allows control and optimization that no horizontal competitor can match. There are 3 additional lessons that apply specifically to founders and company leadership. First, the person who built the company may be the only person who can save it. Gil Amelio was a competent executive with a track record of successful turnarounds. He could not save Apple. Steve Jobs, who was difficult, abrasive, and had been fired for being unmanageable, was the only person who could. Sometimes the personality traits that make someone hard to work with are inseparable from the vision and obsession that make them indispensable. Second, survival requires accepting painful short-term trade-offs for long-term viability. The Microsoft deal in 1997 was humiliating for Apple fans. It was also necessary. Jobs was willing to do things that felt like surrender in order to buy time to build the products that would win. Third, market share is not the same as success. Apple had 3% of the computer market in 1997 and was dying. Today, Apple has roughly 15% of the global smartphone market and is the most profitable company in the category by an enormous margin. Profitability, brand strength, and customer loyalty matter more than raw volume. What is most remarkable about Apple's story is how many times the company should have ended. It should have ended in 1985 when Jobs was forced out. It should have ended in 1996 when no acquirer wanted it. It should have ended in 1997 when it had 90 days of cash left. Each time, the company survived through a combination of decisions that looked irrational at the time but proved correct in retrospect. Bringing back the founder who had been fired, accepting investment from a bitter rival, betting everything on design and user experience in an industry that valued price and specifications, focusing on making fewer, better products in a market that rewarded variety and volume. None of these were safe decisions. All of them worked, and together they turned a dying computer company into the most valuable company in the world. In 1997, Apple was worth less than $3 billion and had 90 days to live. In 2023, Apple passed $3 trillion. The company that Michael Dell said should be shut down and liquidated now generates more profit per year than Dell's entire company generates in revenue. The Macintosh that almost nobody bought in 1997 is now the foundation of a product ecosystem used by over 2 billion people globally. Steve Jobs returned to the company that had fired him and built something greater than what he had built the first time. If this story was worth your time, subscribe. I will see you in the next one.